Hello everyone, my name is Gogoi and today we'll be looking at my project for deep learning fall semester 2025 called Text to Midi using LLM fine-tuning. So without further delay, let's get started. So in the beginning, what actually is Midi? Well, just like any form of data, Midi is a form of data closely related to music. However, it's quite different. We all know that conventional music data consists of MP3 or wave format, which actually contains the sound wave information, or more precisely frequencies, loudness, wave data, etc. However, Midi does not contain that. Let's say we are listening to a song, then the Midi information would refer to the musical data of a song, like what notes are being played, how hard it is being played, what instrument is being played, etc. This is called the Midi data. Inside the Midi data, there are certain terms that refers to certain things. For example, the speed of a song is called tempo, the volume of each note is called velocity, etc. Now, as we have established what is Midi data, we can see that these days, after the advent of many generational models, there has been many models that can do many things like generate images, generate text, and even generate music. However, there isn't any foundational model that can actually generate MIDI output or MIDI information. Thus, to solve this problem and to bridge this gap in research, I decided to make a text to MIDI model that can generate MIDI output based on text. Initially, my idea was to train a transformer model from scratch to generate MIDI data, and while doing the research for the same, I came to know about a research released in December of 2024 named Text to MIDI that proposes a fundamental model. This paper actually made a foundational model to generate MIDI output. However, the output is kind of questionable. As you can see for yourself here, the output seems to not even be in correct order or sequence that makes musical sense. However, the paper seems pretty good, as it was my first starting point for this work. Now, something that's important to mention here is that the budget for this project was only 200 RMB. However, comparing with the Text to Midi paper, they used 6 H100 GPUs running for 7 days just to train a model that's around like 250 million parameters. So, training a foundational model for this purpose would be absolutely impossible at this scale. So after we got that out of the window, now let's look at the data instead. For the data, we use the dataset used by the Text to Midi paper, that is the LAC Midi dataset and Midi caps dataset, along with captions containing around 600,000 samples, out of which we used only around 100,000 samples for our training process. In the dataset, we cropped all the samples into 2 bars. So each bar is like 4 beats in music, referring to 4 ticks. So in total, 8 ticks. You can see the before and after results of processing the data. It was done because my initial thought was, if I could just crop the input data, we would be able to train a foundational model because we would need less computational power. However, I found out that after doing that and running a few initial rounds of training, it was kind of impossible to train a foundational model with just 200 RMB of budget. So I thought that all the hopes for this project was kind of lost here. But you know what? One day, a brilliant idea just popped up in my head. Why not just use LLMs to do this task? Isn't this problem the same as like training an LLM how to play music? Looking from a broader view, it makes sense, right? Because LLMs are already trained to understand the semantic meaning of text. So fine-tuning LLM must definitely result in better output. Also, it does not need that much resources to fine-tune LLMs, right? So I started to delve deeper into this research and this approach. The first problem that arises here is to tokenize the dataset in a way that makes more sense to the LLMs. Since LLMs are good with text and sentences, I had to make sure to feed them the similar kind of data to make MIDI out of them. However, the tokenizer called Remy that the Text to Midi paper uses won't be very suitable for them because it didn't provide a consistent structure for the LLM that would be easier to understand. So after messing around with it for some time, I decided to settle for octuple tokenizer. An octuple token representation for MIDI looks something like this. The reason why I choose this is because unlike the Remy tokenizer, octuple can handle multiple channels, meaning it can retain information for multiple instruments that needs to be generated by the model. But there's a small trick underlying here that made the octuple tokenizer perfect for this job. Here, I had to replace the commas with space and straight bars with full stop and space. As a result, the tokens seemed to look like sentences made out of numbers. It looked like English sentences of numbers. On the contrary, the Remy tokenizer adds new tokens if used for fine-tuning. However, the octuple tokenizer removes this problem as it uses numbers which already exist in most of vocabulary tokens of large LLMs. Thus, following octuple tokenizer with these modifications provided the right recipe for cooking an LLM that could generate MIDI music. Now for the model selection, I wanted to start with a small model and progressively go higher, bigger, and see if I am actually making progress in training the model in generating MIDI, or am I just shooting arrows in the dark. So I started with LoRa training of tiny Llama and started to see if it was actually learning to generate some results. Well, it actually was, and these are the initial results. Although these are not very impressive, they provided a glimpse of hope that this thing could work. So I started to fine-tune Tiny Llama, which provided even more improvements. Here are some of the results. However, it wasn't quite impressive and quite there yet. So for the final version of the model, I chose to use the Llama 3.2 1B instruct version and fine-tune it using Llama Factory on two A880GB GPUs for 12 hours or 3 epochs in total. You can see the hyperparameters here on the screen. After doing so, I started to generate outputs, and now you can see that we are getting more reasonable things. I believe that with more data samples, bigger model, and more GPU resources, better results can be achieved. But out of what I had, I believe the output is really good enough. Here, I would like to show you a direct comparison between text-to-MIDI model and our LLM-based model on the same prompt and using the same sample sounds. We imported both the MIDIs generated by them into FL Studios and played it. Well, you guys are free to judge the output here, but we believe both have a great difference. Our one is even able to generate multiple instruments based on the prompt. One special thing to mention here is the need to have a controlled inference environment for a model to work. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, while doing experiments, I have found out that there are certain parameters that need to be set to certain values for a model to produce good results, and the reasoning behind it goes back to music theory. Let's say we start a melody on a note on a given chord. Well, if we do so, we only have certain choices for the next note so that the melody doesn't sound out of tune. For example, in C chord, we should only stay with C, and for D, we should only stay with D. Thus, we need to have a lower top K value for inference. Here, top K refers to the number of choices that the model have for the next token out of which it will choose one. Another important control parameter is the temperature. It refers to how creative or conservative the model is. Ideally, for music, we need to always follow a strict structure to make sure we don't go out of tune. So, for this, I prefer to set a lower temperature to maintain structural and musical integrity, especially for drums because it has repeating patterns. Thus, with all these, our model can finally make music and can beat the current leading model in just 12 hours of training. So finally, we have come to the end of our research or project in which we have finally successfully fine-tuned an LLM to generate MIDI output, or in other words, taught and machine learning model to play music. So this is the end, and thank you for watching our video. And in the conclusion, we would like to show you some pieces of music generated by our LLM. Enjoy.